Newsfirst Newsline with Faraz Shaukatali.
Hello, good evening, and a very warm welcome to Newsline Zoom. Now then, on this poor day, you'll take notice, of course, that Newsline is still working, and but it's on Zoom. Nevertheless, we continue to talk of matters that has stirred the conscience of this nation, and sometimes the conscience of judges and so on. And there's a very important matter going on currently, and that is, of course, the debate about the PTA, the Prevention of Terrorism Act, the amendments thereof, and so on and so forth. To find out whether we actually need this PTA, whether it is worthy of remaining on our statute books, or whether it is worthy of being binned in the Newsline bin, is probably the question. And to discuss that, we have with us a lawyer, a human rights activist, and someone who's taking this cause forward using social media and other avenues. And that is, of course, Miss Ermiza Tegal. A very good evening to you and warm welcome to Newsline Zoom.
Thank you for having me on, Faraz. Nice to be here. Thank you.
And so the bottom line is the PTA, a temporary measure that was brought in 42 years ago. Do we need it? Why do we need it? And if we don't need it, why don't we need it?
Okay, so my position on the PTA has always been that we don't need it. Like you said, it came into being in 1979. The President Jayawardena brought it in. There was a lot of emergency situations at the time that the law was brought in. It was a very strong parliament. So they passed the law with a 2/3 majority in parliament. Cabinet decided that they would put this law forward and say that they would pass it with the 2/3 majority, knowing that the law was unconstitutional. So Cabinet of the day knew that this law did not conform to the fundamental rights protections, safeguards that we had in our constitution. So in a sense, what we have in our books is an unconstitutional piece of legislation that was supposed to be around for 3 years simply to address an urgent situation. But instead, it has stayed on with us for 42 years very unnecessarily and has led to many a mounting human cost. I would say it's the worst piece of legislation we have currently.
And yes, it's probably one of the worst, but it has also caused so much of hardship and sadness amongst so many people. There are only a few, I suppose, that the public can sort of remember at the snap of their fingers. And we have various cases where it's not solved or anything of the sort. But if you were to examine this in the cold light of, say, a court system, what would you say have been the plus points of the PTA, especially in our fight against terrorism?
I would find it very difficult to find the plus points. And I know this is what people need answers for. And I would say that institutions that have implemented the Prevention of Terrorism Act, so for example, our police, the Terrorist Investigation Department, they are actually answerable to Parliament, to the people, to say what the plus points have been. But we haven't heard those stories. We haven't heard that justification all these years. We have, as lawyers who work with families and work with victims, we certainly know all the minus points. We know all the negatives. We have heard all the stories, the suffering, the human cost. We do not hear about what has worked with the PTA. And that, I think, is a failing of this country to be able to defend it at all, if it needs to be defended.
How would you compare the use of the PTA in Sri Lanka for all these years, 42 years, something that was brought in as a temporary measure. How would you compare the use of that with the American use of a place like Guantanamo Bay?
So I would say that in terms of administrative detentions, it's very similar. It gives power to the executive, the police, to detain people without a judge looking over to see whether this has been properly done. And that is a real problem. So where even in the US, the laws were harsh, the justification was terrorism. But as the emergency situation winds down, you really need to draw back on these laws. And that's not what we did with the PTA. We used the governments of the day have been using the PTA from time to time against various minority communities, those who are not friendly towards the government, those who raise their voices against the government of the day. So it's become quite a tool to be wielded against those who you don't agree with. So I do think there are many similarities between the US and Sri Lanka. And but provisions wise, we are really, really weak because we've not done anything to alleviate the situation legally, politically, or socially.
Some years ago, when the Sunday leader was alive and well, in a matter that arose before court, a horde of lawyers and activists, I suppose, who were also lawyers, decided to represent the Sunday leader. The very next day, the rest of the press carried the story that all these lawyers were branded as traitors. Traitors for attempting to uphold the law, or were they lawyers who were attempting to get rid of the government of the day? What do you think? Can you comment on that aspect in terms of how far ahead Sri Lanka has gone in terms of the tolerance and of the people's rights? Because these rights are enshrined in our constitution, and surely that is not merely a book to be read before one goes off to sleep. It's more a book that needs to be read to inspire us every time we get up in the morning, and to inspire us to go out there and to be treated as equal in every aspect of our day's life, actually. What do you have to say about that?
I couldn't agree more. I would say that we have veered so far off the course in terms of protecting fundamental rights, our fundamental rights, the fundamental rights of people of Sri Lanka when it comes to the PTA. The story that you spoke about in terms of lawyers and how they were labeled, I believe, if I remember correctly, black coat traitors. That was the headline. And that's a very scary situation where you go after those who are simply defending due process rights, those who are simply saying everyone should have a say in court. And when you label them traitors simply because they're doing their job or ensuring that the person that you're not so happy with is getting their say in court, that turns into a situation that it's not safe for anybody. So I think we are very much that sense of fundamental rights, the sense of rights for even those who are suspects of terrorism, those who are suspects of crime, we must afford them their due rights. And I think we have eroded that sense so much right now that as a society, we are very okay with saying, as long as I'm safe, it's okay what happens to another person. If it's from another community, if they say he's a drug addict, if they say he's a terrorist, then I'm going to turn a blind eye to whatever happens to this individual. But as a result, the fabric of society in terms of that getting up in the morning and being inspired about a country that you're proud about in terms of protecting fundamental rights, I think it's eroded really. It's at a very low level.
The flip side, if I could just go down that so that we can let the other side be heard. It's a pity that the other side, in this case, the present government, have a penchant almost for not appearing on programs such as ours. And there are very few people who actually come on these programs and defend their position and articulate their ideology and their reasoning and so on and so forth. So having taken a dig at them for not appearing on our program, let me try to let their side be heard. And it is this, and in law, of course, we must always hear the other side. So let's hear the other side. I'll do it for them because they're not here to do it, all right? So operationally, if we were to talk to President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who was then the Defense Secretary, if we were to talk to, I better say Field Marshal, but the then General Sarat Fonseca, and so on, if I were to speak to them, they will articulate, I'm sure, sorry, that the PTA had its operational use at the time. So if they had a suspect or a whole bunch of suspects, they'd, they'd play the PTA card on them and have them incarcerated without representation, without any of the rights afforded to anyone else. So in that context, do you think that the country and the world at large would have tolerated the PTA up to a point only?
I would love to hear the other side properly defend itself. It is really a pity because it is a matter for public debate that we discuss these issues fully, thoroughly, with facts and figures. We are not, as you're saying, having those debates. But when we talk about the PTA, what we need to also remember is that we have a similar law, which is under the Public Securities Ordinance. When there is an emergency, the president has the power to declare a state of emergency and bring in all of those arbitrary powers that you spoke about. Broad discretion with regard to arrest and detention, administrative detention, all of that. And that is overseen by Parliament. Every month, Parliament extends it to say, yes, we need these draconian measures because we are facing some emergency situation. So when we have a law like that, do we need another law when there is no emergency situation having the same broad powers? I think not.
We had people like Mr. Azad Sali, who was finally cleared of all charges against him. And it appeared then that these charges were sort of lopsided and certainly stank of anything other than justice. Then we have the ongoing case of Mr. Hejaz Hizbullah. I don't think that we ought to be talking too much about that because it's still before the courts. But once again, Mr. Hizbullah's detention has highlighted the almost inequitable nature of the PTA. We've had lots of other things, like we've had the sad and very sad case of Wasim Tajuddin. That was a murder, of course. Well, put it this way, it was a killing that didn't take place within the law. So it must have been premeditated unless the car decided to drive itself into the wall. I'm not making fun of this, but I'm trying to tell you the flip side. So with all these things in hand, and then when we consider that Sri Lanka has such a awful reputation internationally when it comes to our image, when it comes to the accountability process, the responsibility process, and all sorts of things in that stream, one would have thought that any government of the day would have taken the reins, taken the opportunity, and got rid of the PTA once and for all. And so at least one section of international opinion would be shut for good, and they'd have nothing else to say on that matter. Why do you think that successive governments, even the Palanist government, who were sort of, let's say, differently thinking than these people, this lot, and a lot previously. Why do you think they too didn't seize the opportunity to get rid of the PTA then?
It's really, really unfortunate that this opportunity has not been taken. But I don't think that any government that has come into power since this law has been on our books has really felt that they needed to get rid of this law because it gives the government, the executive, vast amounts of power. And to rule based on fear and to rule based on control has been very much a part of our governance structure. If we look at the level of impunity, we look at how police treat suspects on a day-to-day basis, we know that control and fear is the way in which we rule, unfortunately. So the PTA is then the perfect tool for those who rule in that way. We really need a political change if we are looking at moving away from the PTA. And repeal of the PTA will indicate that political change. Respect
for human rights. Now, on that note, let's go for a quick break and take a little peek at this evening's headlines. When we come back, let's pose the question, shall we, whether the PTA is meant for governments who are, in, for want of a better word, wannabe control freaks. We'll see you on the other side of the break, shall we?
Newsfirst Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali.
And welcome back to Newsline Zoom. I'm in conversation with the human rights activist and lawyer, Ermiza Tegal. Welcome back to the program, Ms. Tegal. And the question is the PTA a sort of must-have for successive governments? Because most of these successive governments, I think they're all, have all been sort of control freaks. That's why they need this blessed PTA when everybody else says, look, we don't need it. Are they, do you get a feeling they're control freaks?
That's putting it very colloquially for us. It's really important to understand, I think, also the constitution of Sri Lanka is designed in a way that the executive is very, very powerful. So we have three branches. We have an extremely powerful executive, which means the checks and balance that the legislature, the parliament, and the judiciary can bring over the executive is very weak, right? So with the level of control and fear that you govern by, having broad power is part of the equation. So constitutional change has been something that people like myself have also been pushing for, because you need to get the checks and balances right. Otherwise, you will always have a very, very powerful executive that feels that it needs to broaden its power, keep the PTA. In fact, the PTA is not the only piece of legislation Sri Lanka has to fight terrorism, which I think is a misconception amongst people today. They think if you remove the PTA, Sri Lanka won't be able to deal with terror. It's not true. In the last so many years that Sri Lanka has been dealing with terrorism, we've grown our laws. We have laws on terrorist bombings. We have laws on suppression of terrorist financing. All of those, like an array of about, I can think of about 10 or 11 laws that we have brought into place to fight terrorism. So it's not just the PTA. The PTA is only about arrests and detentions.
Okay, so we had the PTA in place, and they say it was needed, and then we had these bombings. So how does one, if you justify the PTA and say, well, you know, we needed this specific thing, and they could have used it. If I'm not mistaken, the complaint against Zaran was made by Mr. Hilmi Ahmed and Mr. Azad Salih 4 years before it actually, before those dreadful events of that Black Sunday. So what are we missing here? We've got the PTA. We've had a complaint made 4 years ago from members of the same community, and then we had this attack. How do we relate to that then?
I think we don't use it for what we really should. I think it is a political tool, so it's used only for political purposes. And that example that you bring right now, or you talk about right now, is a very clear example of how this PTA didn't work for a very disastrous situation. That the cost of human life with the Easter bombings it should not have happened, right? People are still going through the process of recovering from that. It doesn't prevent terror acts. It hasn't been used to prevent terror acts. And silently, very, very silently, it has been causing terror amongst minority communities, those who dissent, and their families. People are extremely frightened if you're from a particular community and one of your family members have been taken into custody, your life changes completely. You're unable to move on. I heard only yesterday of another case where a Tamil suspect, after a trial, was acquitted, 12 years being detained and acquitted. How does one compensate a human being for a loss of 12 years of life when there has been no evidence to keep him in custody and to carry out a trial? It's devastating.
So these people are held simply on the say-so of some police department, which is absolutely crazy, because they can, and we've known, the whole point is that we know that our investigative authorities don't always play cricket with 11 players on the field. They reinvent the rules, almost reinvent the wheels as they go along. I suppose the public would have greater faith in all this if there was a commitment to justice and the truth, rather than to skew it on political lines where you probably get paid off in terms of political patronage, better jobs, promotions, the inevitable duty-free permit, and so on and so forth. Sri Lanka is littered with this kind of things. I could tell you that I noticed a car the other day, a very upmarket car, and I did what I'm able to do. I checked on the registration number online. This car is worth many times more than $35,000. $35,000 is the limit on that import permit. It says that along with the registration details, but yet that car is in Colombo and it's being driven around, and nobody is doing anything about it. And so someone somewhere has had a favor done, and these documents have been issued. It shouldn't happen. If you go over the limit, you must pay the entire duty. That's just one example. Another, of course, is currently, as we speak, is this the proposed imposition of the surcharge tax, and in there, it's a sort of a case between the rich and the not so rich. So about 63 companies are being asked to pay 25% of profits over 2 billion rupees. But if a company had made 1,998 million, not quite 2 billion, they won't have to pay the 25%. So from where I'm standing, this looks like a terrible, inequitable position. So the PTA is one thing, and so Sri Lanka, the PTA is not on its own. That's the point I'm trying to make.
Yeah, certainly.
How can we have a commitment from the combined opposition, at least on this one matter, that we don't need it, and that we will not have it? Why can't we have at least one opposition group who may have power later? Why can't they say this?
I sincerely hope that this is the opportunity for that. We have heard party leaders from the ones who are in power today, even in the opposition, talk about strengthening the PTA. talk about maintaining the PTA, not necessarily repealing the PTA. I think there is this, as I said before, this rule by fear and divide and control, which if we leave behind, I think this is the opportunity to say that we do not need the PTA. What we need is professionalism in our state apparatus. Also, when we look at fighting terrorism, if we have the standards, professional standards at a very high level, whether it's to do with investigations, whether it's to do with tracking, finances, all of these things, we can also have very high standards with regard to protecting human rights. This is just an easy cop-out way of saying that we are protecting our citizens by having very bad laws in place and doing bad things with those bad laws. We deserve better as citizens of Sri Lanka. We do not, just simply because the stories are not out there of the torture, the forced confessions under the PTA, the lives lost in terms of long-term prolonged detentions, the uncertainty created amongst communities. All that is something that the people of Sri Lanka needs to say no to. Those stories need to come out. And I think programs like this, which is giving the space to raise that concern, does a lot in broadening that message and sharing that message. But we need as citizens to then say no. We can't think that just simply because we are not touched by this, nothing's going to happen to us, let it happen to somebody else. It's not a good equation. It's not a good place to start this conversation.
And in your view, do you think that the PTA will be amended and carry on?
At the moment, the government has proposed to amend. From many quarters, we have heard how the amendments are not adequate. Currently, several persons I know have challenged the amendments before the Supreme Court, and that matter will be taken up before the court shortly to see whether these amendments are actually against the Constitution. But I think there has been an outcry saying this is not sufficient. These amendments are not sufficient. So for example, forced confessions being a key thing that was attached to the PTA, a key problem with the PTA, has not even been touched. The definition of terrorism has not been amended. It's too broad. It has not been amended. So I think at the moment, even though there seems to be an attempt to amend the PTA, it is not a well-intentioned move for the people, and we need to call it out for that.
And Ermiza Tegal, can you tell me, if you were to represent a client who was charged under the PTA, eventually you'll be able to represent that person. Do you think that there are, sometimes do you think perhaps that there is a danger that you too will be labeled a black-coated traitor because you decided to defend someone charged under the PTA?
While the possibility is always there, if we who defend suspects under the PTA are worried about the labels or get scared, I think the fear that the PTA started out with trying to permeate across society has worked. So we have no option. When you hear the stories for us, when you talk to the families, when you talk to those in detention, you are compelled to stand up for their rights. There's really, I cannot see another way of facing this, because not doing it is not just letting down that person and that family, but I think at some point we let down society as well, and the kind of Sri Lanka that we want to see.
And the Sri Lanka that we want to see, would you agree that it is a Sri Lanka where people are not seated on their comfortable do-nothing seats, and to use the tools that are now available, like Zoom and like all these online businesses, like WhatsApp and all that, to make representations to their representatives and to actually highlight the growing inequitable state that we continue to live. I wanted to say we unfortunates continue to live.
I do hope those who are in this business do keep raising their voice about the inequality. I do hope everyone plays their part in it. I do want the citizens of Sri Lanka, I do want people in Sri Lanka to feel comfortable and not feel weighed down because we are in this unfortunate situation. But every one of us needs to see it for what it is, at least in the very least. And if we can do more to make that change.
Well, Ermiza Tegal, thank you very much for being on Newsline Zoom. And as we leave you today, we leave you with the hope that Sri Lanka will be actually an equitable place to live in for all, across the communities and across all sorts of anything. That Sri Lanka is one country, one law, one country, but not just a label, really one country, one law. What chances are there?
Thank you so much, Faraz, first of all, for having me on. It was a pleasure indeed. I think I have hope. I would not be doing the work that I do if I didn't have hope. One country, one law is a problematic slogan for me, so let's not get into that. That's another half an hour. But I really do think that there is opportunity. I think people are hearing this message, and that's an important first step forward.
And as we leave you on this Poya Day, let's hope that actually we will all live in a happy space within one Sri Lanka. Take care and God bless you all.
Newsfirst. News